A camel. Just a camel. Not a queen, not an army, not even a piece of disputed land. Just an old, gentle camel, grazing peacefully on land that wasn't hers. But one arrow, fired by one man in one moment of anger, was enough to ignite a fire that would not go out for 40 full years. 40 years of blood, of revenge, of entire generations born knowing nothing of life except war. This is not a legend. This really happened to the Arabs centuries before Islam, and it still echoes in their proverbs to this day. This is the story of the Basus War. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn about how this war started will shock you more than you expect. Before the light of Islam rose over the Arabian Peninsula, roughly a century and a half before that, this land was an entirely different world. There was no central state to govern it, no unified law to enforce, no borders drawn on any map. There was only one thing that defined who you were, what you were entitled to, and who would protect you if you were wronged. The tribe. The tribe was everything. It was your army, your court, your identity, and often even your religion. And in this world, there was one rule that could never be broken, no matter the cost. The blood of the tribe must be answered with blood. This wasn't just a tradition. It was an unwritten law, stronger than any written one. If someone from your tribe was killed, their killer, or someone from his tribe, had to be killed in return, until balance was restored. This concept, which seems primitive and brutal to us today, was actually the only system standing between order and total chaos. But what happens when that system spirals out of control? What happens when justified vengeance turns into an endless spiral with no way out? That's exactly what you're about to witness. And if this is your first time watching, join us now, because this channel takes you on journeys like this every week, deep into the history that never makes it into textbooks. In the northeast of the Arabian Peninsula, toward what is now Iraq, two great tribes lived side by side, connected by a distant common ancestor. Bakr ibn Wa'il and Taghlib ibn Wa'il, both descended from the same forefather. Both shared the same language, the same customs, and often even intermarried. They weren't enemies. In fact, they were frequent allies, sharing pastures, trading in the same markets. But beneath that calm surface lay old tensions, rivalry over leadership, over grazing land, over who truly held power in the region. And standing at the center of this fragile balance was one man who represented the height of power and prestige at that moment in history. His name was Kulayb ibn Rabi'a, Lord of Taghlib, one of the greatest chiefs the Arabs had ever known. It's said that Kulayb's power and prestige were so absolute that no one could graze their herds on his land without his permission, and no one dared light a fire near his own. He held the final word in matters of peace and war, and his marriage to Jalila, sister of the chief of Bakr, had strengthened this fragile alliance between the two tribes. Everything seemed stable until that one day. Picture this, all this balance, all this alliance, on the verge of collapse, because of an incident whose surface appearance was almost laughably small. There was an old woman named Basus bint Munkid, living under the protection of the chief of Bakr, Jassas ibn Mura, who was also Kulayb's own cousin and brother-in-law. Basus had settled under Jassas's protection, and with her was an old camel named Sarab. On an ordinary day, Sarab wandered off to graze and strayed into land that Kulayb considered his own exclusive territory, land forbidden to other people's livestock. Kulayb saw the strange camel grazing on his land, and driven by the pride and dominance he was used to imposing on everyone around him, he could not let it go. He shot an arrow, not simply to kill the camel, but according to the most widely told account, to strike its udder, a deliberate insult, a clear message. No one enters my land without paying a price. When Basus saw her camel wounded, she didn't just grieve for the animal. She understood immediately that this wasn't merely an attack on a camel. It was an insult aimed at her, at the man who protected her, and at his entire tribe. It's said she stood among her people and cried out verses of poetry, calling on her kin for help, reminding them that she was under their protection and that her honor had just been violated while they stood by. This detail, viewer, is the key to everything that follows. Because in Arab culture at the time, insulting someone under your protection was an insult to you personally, and failing to respond to it was a stain that could never be washed away. Think about it for a moment. If you were in Jassas's place and you heard this cry for help from a woman under your protection, what would you have done? That exact question is what changed the course of Arab history. Basus's cry for help wasn't the only thing that reached Jassas. Word also came to him that Kulayb, after wounding the camel, had directly mocked and provoked him, essentially daring him. And what are you going to do about it? It was these words, even more than the incident itself, that lit the fire of rage in Jassas's heart. Because this was no longer about a camel. It had become something far deeper. Honor, dignity, and Jassas's own standing before his people. Would he stay silent and be remembered forever as a man who allowed those under his protection to be humiliated? Or would he respond? Jassas hesitated. Kulayb was no ordinary man. He was his sister's husband, his own cousin, the most powerful man in the entire region. But anger, once mixed with wounded pride, rarely leaves room for calm thinking. In a direct confrontation between the two men, after a heated exchange of words, Jassas ibn Murrah struck Kulayb ibn Rabia with his spear and killed him. In that moment, Jassas didn't realize he hadn't just killed one man. He had killed years of balance. He had killed an alliance. He had killed peace itself. This is where the real story begins. Because what you're about to see over the next stretch of this documentary is 40 years of events that shaped a massive part of Arab poetic and cultural identity to this very day. If you're enjoying this so far, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history like you do. The news spread like wildfire. Kulayb, Lord of Taghlib, was dead, and his killer was Jassas, Lord of Bakr. The shock was overwhelming, not only because of Kulayb's stature, but because the killer and the victim belonged to the same extended family. Cousins, bound by marriage. Muhalhil, Kulayb's brother, a poet and a known warrior, was in complete denial at first. He refused to believe that Jassas, his own cousin and brother-in-law, could have done this. It's said he kept searching for excuses, for some other explanation, because he simply could not accept that the blood binding them together had been spilled by their own hands. But reality left him no room to escape it. Kulayb was dead, and under the unwritten law of the desert, blood had to be answered with blood. This is where the real fracture began. The tribe of Taghlib, now led by Muhalhil, demanded full vengeance. Kulayb's blood could only be answered by Jassas's blood, or the blood of one of Bakr's own chiefs. But some of Bakr's wiser elders tried to calm things down, offering blood money, a large compensation meant to close the matter without further killing. This was the decisive fork in the road for both tribes. Accepting the compensation meant peace. Refusing it meant war. A war no one could say when it would end. What do you think? Was blood money ever going to be enough to compensate for the death of a chief like Kulayb? History was about to prove that Muhalhil saw it very differently. Muhalhil flatly refused the compensation. This wasn't simple stubbornness. Muhalhil carried a double weight: the loss of his great brother and now the burden of being responsible for the honor of an entire tribe. He was nicknamed Al-Muhalhil because, according to some accounts, he was the first to compose poetry in a new, delicate, flowing style, one that later became a genuinely powerful tool of psychological warfare. Muhalhil began reciting poetry in mourning for his brother. But this mourning was not quiet grief. It was a directed fire, rallying his tribe toward vengeance, reminding them every single day that Kulayb's blood had not yet been answered. His verses spread among the tribes, recited in the marketplaces, passed from mouth to mouth, and became real fuel that kept igniting the war further and further. While Muhalhil refused any compromise, Taghlib began preparing seriously for retaliation. This was no longer a matter of individual anger. It had become a full tribal war project. In response, Bakr found itself in an impossible position. It had to defend Jassas, its own son and chief, even though what he had done was, in the eyes of many, a grave mistake. And so, with a single decision to refuse peace, an individual incident transformed into a fateful conflict between two entire tribes. Notice how a single word, placed in the mouth of a grieving, furious poet, can become more dangerous than any sword. This lesson would repeat itself again and again throughout Arab history. The first clashes began small. Minor raids, mutual ambushes, skirmishes between horsemen from both sides. But things escalated quickly. Every raid left new casualties behind, and every new casualty demanded a new act of vengeance, in a cycle with no end in sight. Among the earliest major battles was the Day of Al-Nihi, where the two sides clashed violently, resulting in heavy losses on both fronts. Then came the Day of Waridat, and other battles that followed in scattered locations across northern Arabia, each one adding a new layer of blood to a ledger of vengeance that never seemed to close. But the fiercest of these battles, and the one most deeply etched into Arab poetic memory, was known as the Day of Talaq al-Lumam. It got its name because the warriors, as a vow that they would never flee the battlefield no matter the cost, shaved their heads as a mark of their absolute determination to fight to the death. On this day, an enormous number of men fell on both sides, and among those killed, according to the accounts, was Hammam ibn Murrah, one of Bakr's senior commanders and Jassas's own brother. Muhalhil, who led Taghlib in this battle, finally felt he was drawing closer to his revenge. But the war, as he would soon discover, had already moved far beyond any rational calculation of vengeance. This is only the beginning of the story. What you're about to see next shows how a war that feels righteous to those fighting it can turn into a tragedy that consumes everyone, without exception. Stay with me. Of all the days of the Basus War, one battle stands out as the bloody peak of the entire conflict. The Day of Uniza. On this day, Taghlib rode out in full force, led by Muhalhil himself, for a decisive confrontation with Bakr. The human losses on this day were so staggering that historical accounts describe it as one of the most violent days among all the Arabs of the pre-Islamic era. A huge number of horsemen from both Bakr and Taghlib fell in this battle, including leading figures from both sides. But the deeper impact of the Day of Uniza wasn't just in the death toll. It was in something else entirely. Both sides began to realize that this war no longer served anyone. Every battle produced new dead who demanded new vengeance. Every new act of vengeance produced another battle. An endless circle, devouring the sons of both tribes, generation after generation. Even Muhalhil himself, once the fiercest advocate for revenge, began, according to some accounts, to feel the weight of what he had done. He had watched with his own eyes as his personal grief for his brother turned into a collective tragedy that consumed thousands of innocent lives. But once a war reaches this scale, it becomes extremely difficult to stop. Every family that lost a son, a brother, or a husband had now become part of the cycle of vengeance, whether they wanted to be or not. If you're wondering how a war can drag on for decades, even when everyone involved knows it's a catastrophe, the answer lies in the very nature of vengeance itself. And we'll unpack that further in the next part. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss our next episodes on the greatest conflicts of ancient Arab history. Throughout the years of the war, attempts at peace were never entirely absent. Time and again, wise elders from both tribes tried to find a way out of this spiral. There were temporary truces, agreements to halt the fighting, even attempts to formally tally the dead from each side to determine who still had the right to further vengeance and who owed compensation. But every single time, these attempts collapsed, either because a new incident reignited the anger or because one side felt the scales of blood had not yet been balanced fairly. There were also attempts to bring in neutral arbitrators from other tribes, called upon to assess the casualties on each side and try to reach a settlement. But the real problem was never about the numbers. It was something far deeper. Wounded pride, a collective memory that refused to forget, and new generations born into the war who knew nothing of real peace, only the endless recounting of who killed whom. Even Muhalhil, in his later years, is said to have grown weary of the war and to have tried himself to find a way out, after losing his own son in one of the battles, tasting firsthand the very loss he had inflicted on so many others. But by then, the circle had grown far too wide, beyond the ability of any single man, no matter his stature, to stop it alone. Consider this painful irony. The very man whose poetry ignited the war was later the one who tried to put it out. Can regret ever undo what rage set in motion? According to most historical accounts, the Basus War lasted nearly 40 full years. 40 years. An entire generation was born, grew up, and grew old, living entirely in the shadow of this war. Children were born into war and never knew their fathers as anything but warriors. Whole families on both sides were wiped out or scattered. The economy of both tribes, which depended on herding and trade, was nearly destroyed by the endless raids. In the end, the war did not conclude with a decisive victory for either side. It ended, instead, in something closer to mutual exhaustion. Both tribes had lost so many of their men, so much of their resources, so much of the regional power they once held before the conflict began. Some accounts suggest that the final peace came through mediation by figures from other tribes who had been watching the situation for years and understood that this endless bleeding served no one in the region. Eventually, a form of settlement was reached, one that included mutual acknowledgement of the devastating losses on both sides and a formal end to the state of open war. But one question lingered in Arab memory for centuries afterward. Was it worth it? 40 years and thousands of dead over an old camel and a single insulting word. That very question is what turned the Basus War from a mere historical event into an eternal proverb, still invoked to this day. And we'll uncover exactly why in the final part of this episode. Today, more than 1,500 years after the Basus War broke out, its name still lives on in everyday Arabic. When someone says, "more ill-omened than al-Basus," they are directly invoking this very incident. A timeless example of how a small event can drag an entire people into catastrophe. The Basus War became, in Arab heritage, a symbol of blind vengeance, of the vicious cycle that traps those who refuse to forgive, and of how dangerous it is when wounded pride becomes an inexhaustible fuel for war. Muhalhil's poetry, born from this very tragedy, is considered one of the earliest examples of elegiac lyric poetry in the Arabic tradition, and it went on to influence entire generations of poets after him. Even the name Jassas itself became, in popular Arab memory, a byword for anyone who triggers a catastrophe through one reckless act without weighing its consequences. And perhaps most importantly, the Basus War stands as one of the clearest historical examples of how a culture of honor and vengeance, when left without limits, can tear entire communities apart from within. This lesson didn't remain locked in history. Centuries later, with the rise of Islam, it helped inspire legal and social frameworks specifically designed to regulate matters of blood vengeance and compensation, precisely to prevent tragedies like this one from repeating. Isn't it remarkable that an incident involving a camel, which happened more than 1,500 years ago, is still used as a proverb in everyday conversations, often without people even realizing where it came from? Let us know in the comments. Had you ever heard this proverb before? Looking back today at the Basus War, from a distance of more than 1,500 years, it's tempting to ask, how could all of this have been allowed to happen? How did an old camel, one angry arrow, and a single mocking word turn into 40 years of destruction? But the truth is, this story isn't as distant from us as we like to think. Every day, somewhere in the world, small disputes, when left without wisdom and without compromise, still turn into conflicts far larger than anything they began as. The Basus War isn't just a story about two ancient Arab tribes. It's a timeless human story about pride, about anger, about vengeance, and about the devastating price everyone pays when one side refuses to simply say, enough. Muhalhil, the poet whose words ignited the fire of vengeance, left behind a double legacy. Some of the most enduring verses ever composed in elegy and pride, and, at the same time, a painful lesson about how unaddressed grief can spiral into an endless cycle of destruction. And Jassas, who struck a single blow in one moment of rage, remains etched in Arab memory as a permanent warning. Beware the moment of anger whose consequences you have not measured. If this episode took you on a real journey into the heart of this extraordinary historical event, you know what to do. Hit like, share this with anyone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because every week, we take you on a new journey deep into human history that you won't find told anywhere else. The Basus War, 40 years, because no one dared to be the first to say, enough. See you in the next episode.